point about the cabinet itself or the makeup is important. But every president, I think, has turned to former presidents in a careful and proper and appropriate manner, either for advice and counsel. You obviously had an unusual situation with President Bush 43 and President Bush 41, and that had to be handled in a very particular, careful manner, just like obviously President Clinton and Secretary Clinton would have to be handled if Secretary Clinton's elected. But as a general rule, I think any sitting president will consider and indeed use former presidents in specific situations, either for advice and counsel about other world leaders that they dealt with, other particular issues that they are knowledgeable about, and in many cases ask a former president, as we did Jimmy Carter, to travel to North Korea because he knew the North Korean leader with the crisis we were facing there. Or when we had certain bipartisan efforts where we had 4 presidents come to Washington and endorse and affirm a particular legislative initiative. So I think you'll see that continued as a precedent that's been set over the years, I think more in recent years than maybe 30, 40 years ago. I think that's a good thing, but it has to be done in a very careful, thoughtful, balanced way. You can't obviously overdo it, but I think any sitting president would be wise to consider using the knowledge and wisdom and ability of former presidents in a careful, judicious manner.
You've been waiting quite a while.
Not 73 days, but yeah. Jesse Rifkin, I'm with the National Press Club's newsletter, The Wire. When it comes to filling vacancies, there's one thing that makes this upcoming transition different than any others, which is there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Should that be filled before anything else, later, around the same time, as other positions in the White House and Cabinet?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to take it, and I just want to answer it. I mean, look, I think that the truth is that it's important. One of the areas that's really important to focus on is that the Senate. A lot of folks, when you look at the confirmation process, point to the Senate as being the bottleneck. And it's interesting if you look at the data. 70% of the time, historically, for filling jobs on the executive branch side has actually been held by the executive and only 30% by the Senate. Now, clearly, some of the things the executive is doing is because they expect the Senate to be asking certain questions or whatever it might be. But the point of that statistic is to say that there, in fact, are lots of things that the executive branch can do to speed up the process of getting leadership in place in faster time. And the Senate needs to be a partner as well. The judicial appointments are part of what also clogs up the system, and it's not just the Supreme Court; it's also, at the Court of Appeals and the district court level too. So there's a lot of balancing that has to go on in terms of Senate floor time. There's a lot of critical equations that have to be looked at. The important thing, though, again, for this is to have an expectation, to have the goal that Clay talks about getting the leadership team in place, and understanding that there are going to be certain things that you have to face that are going to be constraints that you can anticipate, and there are going to be a bunch that you can't. And to have that be part of your planning process, to understand those asteroids will come in, has to be, again, part and parcel of what has to happen. So whether it's the Supreme Court seat or anything else, there'll be things that are going on, a financial crisis, and you just have to prepare to deal with the unexpected in addition to the enormity of the task that you know that you got to deal with.
Well, before we adjourn, I just want to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have. On October 3rd, we're going to have the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, speaking at a luncheon. On the 7th, we're going to have Roberto Azevedo, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. And on October 12th, it was just announced that we're going to have the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus. And so for those and other newsmaker events, I encourage everyone to go to press.org. I very much want to thank our panelists today. I thought this was a great discussion and an important one. And I want to thank everyone who came for our news conference here and those who are watching on television and radio. Thank you.
They're still outside. they're outside?
Yep. And they're all, and also online. There's more online, so there's so much that could go in the book, and the books are on the table.
There are about 2 outside, but it's all online. Yeah, do you have a card? I'll email you.
I'm bad press.
Of course.
Are there any more out? They're going to be going.
I think there. Oh, wait, here's one right here. Take that one. It's yours.
Yes, so that is.
So I think I agree with you. The History Channel is doing something. A couple
And a note on transitions, Politico reporting that Hillary Clinton has tapped the Reverend Leah Daltrey, a seasoned Democratic operative, to help staff her potential White House as the Democratic candidate slowly but surely builds her transition team. You can read more at Politico.com. Meanwhile, Newt Gingrich is advising Donald Trump, don't bring up Bill Clinton's past marital infidelities in the next debate. The former House Speaker is an informal advisor to the Trump campaign. He made the comments in a podcast interview with ABC News. And this evening, the former Speaker and former Labor Secretary Robert Reich will debate whether Donald Trump can make America great again. It's the semi-annual Monk debate on policy issues in Toronto, Canada. C-SPAN 2 will have live coverage at 7 p.m. Eastern. And here on C-SPAN at 8 Eastern, the opening of the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. President Obama was joined by the First Lady and former President George W. Bush and his wife Laura at the dedication last Saturday, and it'll re-air again tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern.
What makes movies or stories about people and in crisis or in a crisis, and the crisis either changes them or changes everybody else. And if you don't show conflict, and if you don't show flaws, and if you don't show someone growing out of their flaws or something like that, you're seeing something that you can't really connect to, and it doesn't quite have the same impact.
Sunday night on Q&A, John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine and movie reviewer for the Weekly Standard, talks about the movies he's reviewed, ranging from Lincoln, Spotlight, to Straight Outta Compton.
The movie itself, as a kind of classic, as an update of the classic showbiz story about how the band got together and recorded its big hits, was pretty strikingly, effective.
Sunday night, C-SPAN. Back to the U.S. after a 5.5-hour visit to Israel for the funeral of Shimon Peres. The former prime minister died at the age of 93 Wednesday, 2 weeks after suffering a stroke. In his eulogy, President Obama called Mr. Peres a man who saw, quote, all people as deserving of dignity and respect. We're going to show you highlights from today's service.
אני מתכבד להזמין את נשיא ארצות הברית ברק אובמה להיכנס אל רחבת הטקס.
These crazy days indeed.
How are you? How are you?
Merci.
מי תפס לי את זה?
קהל נכבד, נשיא מדינת ישראל, ראובן רובי ריבלין והגברת נחמה ריבלין, ראש ממשלת ישראל בנימין נתניהו ורעייתו גברת שרה נתניהו, יושב ראש הכנסת חבר הכנסת יולי יואל אדלשטיין ורעייתו גברת אירינה נבזביל, נשיאת בית המשפט העליון מרים נאור ובעלה פרופסור אריה נאור.
איפה אשתי?
פה, בהמשך, שרה מצוין. אתה יכול, יש לך לעבוד שם. טוב.
שום לחציית יד על כספים. Should do this more.
Yeah.
Not on this.
I know. You got it all right. I think you're doing something.
You're helping good.
Condolences.
ראש הממשלה, אנחנו חייבים להתחיל בטקס. פעמיים.
לא.
ראש הממשלה, הגברת. וואו, המשפחה תכף תגיעו מהארון, שרה נאבל צריכה לשבת, לעמוד, ראש הממשלה, אפשר להגיד להם לשבת, שישבו כולם. הארון נכנס עכשיו. כולם כמה צעדים. כולם? רגע, כולם החוצה. כולם החוצה. כולם החוצה. אתם ממש מגזימים. סליחה, כולם החוצה. מספיק. זהו, עכשיו. מספיק. כולם אחורה. מזמור, כולם אחורה. גם אתה, איתי. חבר'ה, אחורה. מזמור, אחורה. כולם אחורה.
קהל נכבד, נקום לכניסת ארונו של נשיא המדינה התשיעי שמעון פרס.
תזוז.
יושב בסתר עליון, בצל שדי יתלונן. אומר לאדוני מחסי ומצודתי, אלוהי אבטח בו. כי הוא יצילך מפח יכוש, מדבר הבור. בברתו יסך לך ותחת כנפר תכסה, צילה וסוחרה מיתו. לא תירא מפחד לילה, מחץ יעוף יומם. מדבר באופר יהלוך, מכתב ישור צהריים. יפול מצידך אלך ובא מימינך אליך לא ייגש. רק בעיניך תביט ושילומת רשעים תראה. כי אתה, אדוני מחסי, אל עליון שם את מעונך, לא תאונה אליך רעה, ונגע לא יקרב באוהליך. כי מלאכיו יצווה לך לשמורך בכל דרכיך. על כפיים יישאונך פן תיגוף באבן רגליך. על שחר ופתן תדרוך, תרמוס כפיר ותנין. כי בי חשק ופלטהו, אסגבהו כי ידע שמי. יקראני ועינהו עמו אנוכי בצרה, אחלצהו ואכבדהו. אורך ימים אשביעהו, ויראהו בישועתי. שיר המעלות ממעמקים קראתיך אדוני. אדוני שמע בקולי, תהיינה אוזניך קשובות לכל תחנוני. אם עוונות תשמוע, אדוני מי יעמוד. כי ימך סליחה למען תברך. קיוויתי אדוני כי לך נפשי, ולדברו אוכלתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי עם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו פדות. והוא יפדה את ישראל מכל עוונותיו. שיר למעלות, אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ידור שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר ישראל. אדוני שומרך, אדוני צילך על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה. אדוני ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך. אדוני ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם. שיר המעלות ממעמקים קראתיך אדוני. אדוני שמע בקולי, תהיינה אוזניך קשובות לכל תחנוני. אם עוונות תשמוריה, אדוני מי יעמוד. כי ימך סליחה למען תברך. קיוויתי אדוני כי בטח נפשי, ולדברו אוכלתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים אל הבוקר, שומרים אל הבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, עם אדוני החסד, והרבה עמו פדות. והוא יפדה את ישראל מכל עוונותיו.
המשמר יפתיף את אשתו. הצק, שק. המשמר יציג את אשתו. הצק, שק. המשמר יעבור לנוח, עמוד נוח.
משמר על סטארט. רועד. חוצה, פנה. קדימה צעד.
נא לשבת.
יש שמות? כן.
משמר יעבור לדום. משמר, דום. משמר יעבור לנוח. עמוד, נוח.
To the Peres family, President Rivlin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the leader of the Knesset, and President Obama, and all the distinguished leaders who have come from around the world. Yesterday, the Prime Minister did something that was unthinkable back in the dark ages when I was President of the United States. He sent out a tweet. And the tweet reminded us of a simple fact. It was Israel's first day without Shimon Peres. Yes, he was in the Knesset for 48 years, but for more than 70 of his 93 years. In one way or the other, in and out of government, he was a public servant. I was honored to share almost 25 of those years with him. First, in our common efforts with Prime Minister Rabin of blessed memory, to forge a just and lasting peace between Israel and Palestinians. Then, just as his friend, someone who listened to, learned from, and laughed with him, and always was in awe of his endless capacity to move beyond even the most crushing setbacks in order to seize the possibilities of each new day. I am honored the family asked me to tell you what he meant to someone who is not a citizen of this country I love so much, but who was nevertheless blessed and inspired. And I think in many ways is representative of millions more he touched, though he never met. Israel watched him grow first from sort of young genius, doing his best to build undefeatable defense forces, through a long life to become a wise champion of our common humanity. Someone who wanted the best for all children. Yes, the Israeli children, but also the children of his neighbors in the larger world. The previous speakers have reminded me again of a clip I saw last night on television where Shimon was being interviewed by Charlie Rose. And he looked at him sort of saying, I'm going to serve a softball up to you and watch you hit a home run. What do you want your legacy to be? And he said, I'm more concerned about tomorrow than yesterday. Our complicated, brilliant friend, steered by a simple, straightforward creed. Thanks in no small measure to his constant, relentless urging, the tomorrows he envisions are already being lived here in Israel by many young people, in spite of all the troubles. You heard the Prime Minister talk about the dedication of the new high-tech park. He's been talking to me about that for 25 years. And there are young people now throughout the region who are trying to break both the mental and the material chains that have held them in bondage, thanks in no small measure to the inspiration he provided. As has been said, his critics often claimed he was a naive, overly optimistic dreamer. They were only wrong about the naive part. He knew exactly what he was doing in being overly optimistic. He knew exactly what he was doing with his dreams. He never gave up on anybody. I mean, anybody. You heard the Prime Minister talk about their beautiful friendship. It followed a very tough campaign. But Shimon always kept the door open. We shared so many wonderful times, but my personal favorite was sitting with him and his old foe and personal friend Ariel Sharon at his 80th birthday party. Listening to the back and forth was a sight to behold. It was worth the price of admission, as the saying goes. In addition, it was a perfect Paris night. The stage was full of young people talking about what he had meant to their lives, including a young Ethiopian member of your defense forces who was met as a very young child at the airport as part of the operation he supported. The night ended, however, with a choir of Israeli Jewish and Arab children singing together John Lennon's wonderful song, Imagine. Shimon actually could imagine all the people living in the world today. He imagined all the things the rest of us could do. He started off life as Israel's brightest student, became its best teacher, and ended up its biggest dreamer. He lived 93 years in a state of constant wonder over the unbelievable potential of all the rest of us to rise above our wounds, our resentments, our fears, to make the most of today and claim the promise of tomorrow. Now, it must have been hard for him to do this. It's easy to say things like this at a memorial service. It's hard to do. First, he had to master his own demons, forgive himself for his own mistakes, and get over his own disappointments. The monumental effort required to do that grew his heart to be bigger than his brain, which is really saying something. That effort also, I am convinced, is what made him forever young. Now he is gone, leaving only a blessed memory and a powerful example. That's more than enough. If those of us who loved him from near and far accept our duty to keep his gifts alive. So for the rest of our lives, whenever the road we travel comes to a dead end, or the good we seek to do hits a stone wall, or the hand of friendship we extend meets only a cold stare, in his honor, I ask that we remember Shimon Peres's luminous smile and imagine.
The Honorable Barack Obama, President of the United States of America. אתכבד להזמין את נשיא ארצות הברית, ברק אובמה.
Zvia, Yoni, Kimmy, and generations of the Perez family, President Rivlin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, members of the Israeli government and the Knesset, heads of state and government, and guests from around the world, including President Abbas, whose presence here is a gesture and a reminder of the unfinished business of peace. To the people of Israel, I could not be more honored to be in Jerusalem to say farewell to my friend Shimon Peres, who showed us that justice and hope are at the heart of the Zionist idea. A free life in a homeland regained. A secure life in a nation that can defend itself by itself. A full life in friendship with nations who can be counted on as allies. Always. A bountiful life, driven by the simple pleasures of family and by big dreams. This was Shimon Peres's life. This is the state of Israel. This is the story of the Jewish people over the last century. And it was made possible by a founding generation that counts Shimon as one of its own. Shimon once said, "The message of the Jewish people to mankind is that faith and moral vision can triumph over all adversity." For Shimon, that moral vision was rooted in an honest reckoning of the world as it is, Born in the shtetl, he said he felt surrounded by a sea of thick and threatening forests. When his family got the chance to go to Palestine, his beloved grandfather's parting words were simple. Shimon, stay a Jew. Propelled with that faith, he found his home. He found his purpose. He found his life's work. But he was still a teenager when his grandfather was burned alive by the Nazis in the town where Shimon was born. The synagogue in which he prayed became an inferno. The railroad tracks that had carried him toward the promised land also delivered so many of his people to death camps. And so from an early age, Shimon bore witness to the cruelty that human beings could inflict on each other. The ways that one group of people could dehumanize another. The particular madness of anti-Semitism, which has run like a stain through history. That understanding of man's ever-present sinfulness would steel him against hardship and make him vigilant against threats to Jewry around the world. But that understanding would never harden his heart. It would never extinguish his faith. Instead, it broadened his moral imagination and gave him the capacity to see all people as deserving of dignity and respect. It helped him see not just the world as it is, but the world as it should be. What Shimon did to shape the story of Israel is well chronicled. Starting in the kibbutz he founded with his love Sonia, he began the work of building a model community. Ben-Gurion called him to serve the Haganah at headquarters to make sure that the Jewish people had the armaments and the organization to secure their freedom. After independence, surrounded by enemies who denied Israel's existence and sought to drive it into the sea, the child who had wanted to be a poet of stars became a man who built Israel's defense industry, who laid the foundation for the formidable armed forces that won Israel's wars. His skill secured Israel's strategic position. His boldness sent Israeli commandos to Entebbe and rescued Jews from Ethiopia. His statesmanship built an unbreakable bond with the United States of America and so many other countries. His contributions didn't end there. Shimon also showed what people can do when they harness reason and science to a common cause. He understood that a country without many natural resources could more than make up for it with the talents of its people. He made hard choices to roll back inflation and climb out from a terrible economic crisis. He championed the promise of science and technology to make the desert bloom and turn this tiny country into a central hub of the digital age, making life better not just for people here, but for people around the world. Indeed, Shimon's contribution to this nation is so fundamental, so pervasive, that perhaps sometimes they can be overlooked. For a younger generation, Shimon was probably remembered more for a peace process that never reached its end point. They would listen to critics on the left who might argue that Shimon did not fully acknowledge the failings of his nation, or perhaps more numerous critics on the right who argued that he refused to see the true wickedness of the world and called him naive. But whatever he shared with his family or his closest friends, to the world, he brushed off the critics. And I know from my conversations with him that his pursuit of peace was never naive. Every Yom HaShana, he read the names of the family that he lost. As a young man, he had fed his village by working in the fields during the day, but then defending it by carrying a rifle at night. He understood in this war-torn region, where too often Arab youth are taught to hate Israel from an early age. He understood just how hard peace would be. I'm sure he was alternatively angry and bemused to hear the same critics who called him hopelessly naive depend on the defense architecture that he himself had helped to build. I don't believe he was naive, but he understood from hard-earned experience that true security comes through making peace with your neighbors. We won them all, he said of Israel's wars. But we did not win the greatest victory that we aspired to: release from the need to win victories. And just as he understood the practical necessity of peace, Shimon believed that Israel's exceptionalism was rooted not only in fidelity to the Jewish people, but to the moral and ethical vision, the precepts of his Jewish faith. The Jewish people weren't born to rule another people, he would say. From the very first day, we are against slaves and masters. Out of the hardships of the diaspora, he found room in his heart for others who suffered. He came to hate prejudice with the passion of one who knows how it feels to be its target. Even in the face of terrorist attacks, even after repeated disappointments at the negotiation table, he insisted that as human beings, Palestinians must be seen as equal in dignity to Jews and must therefore be equal in self-determination. Because of his sense of justice, his analysis of Israel's security, his understanding of Israel's meaning, he believed that the Zionist idea would be best protected when Palestinians too had a state of their own. Of course, we gather here in the knowledge that Shimon never saw his dream of peace fulfilled. The region is going through a chaotic time. Threats are ever present. And yet he did not stop dreaming, and he did not stop working. By the time that I came to work with Shimon, he was in the twilight of his years. although he might not admit it. I would be the 10th U.S. president since John F. Kennedy to sit down with Shimon, the 10th to fall prey to his charms. I think of him sitting in the Oval Office, this final member of Israel's founding generation, under the portrait of George Washington, telling me stories from the past, but more often talking with enthusiasm of the present. His most recent lecture, his next project, his plans for the future, the wonders of his grandchildren. In many ways, he reminded me of some other giants of the 20th century that I've had the honor to meet. Men like Nelson Mandela, women like Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, leaders who've seen so much, whose lives span such momentous epics, that they find no need to posture or traffic in what's popular in the moment. People who speak with depth and knowledge, not in sound bites. They find no interest in polls or fads. And like these leaders, Shimon could be true to his convictions even if they cut against the grain of current opinion. He knew better than the cynic that if you look out over the arc of history, human beings should be filled not with fear, but with hope. I'm sure that's why he was so excited about technology, because for him it symbolized the march of human progress. And it's why he loved so much to talk about young people, because he saw young people unburdened by the prejudices of the past. It's why he believed in miracles, because in Israel he saw a miracle come true. As Americans and Israelis, we often talk about the unbreakable bonds between our nations. And yes, these bonds encompass common interests, vital cooperation that makes both our nations more secure. But today, we are reminded that the bonds which matter most run deeper. Anchored in a Judeo-Christian tradition, we believe in the irreducible value of every human being. Our nations were built on that idea. They were built in large part by stubborn idealists and striving immigrants, including those who had fled war and fled oppression. Both our nations have flaws that we have not always fixed, corners of our history which date back to our founding that we do not always squarely address. But because our founders planted not just flags in the eternal soil, but also planted the seeds of democracy, we have the ability to always pursue a better world. We have the capacity to do what is right. As an American, as a Christian, a person partly of African descent, born in Hawaii, a place that could not be further than where Shimon spent his youth, I took great pleasure in my friendship with this older, wiser man. We shared a love of words and books and history. And perhaps like most politicians, we shared too great a joy in hearing ourselves talk. But beyond that, I think our friendship was rooted in the fact that I could somehow see myself in his story, and maybe he could see himself in mine. Because for all of our differences, both of us had lived such unlikely lives. It was so surprising to see the two of us where we had started, talking together in the White House, meeting here in Israel. And I think both of us understood that we were here only because, in some way, we reflected the magnificent story of our nations. Shimon's story, the story of Israel, the experience of the Jewish people. I believe it is universal. It's the story of a people who, over so many centuries in the wilderness, never gave up on that basic human longing to return home. It's the story of a people who suffered the boot of oppression and the shutting of the gas chamber's door, and yet never gave up on a belief in goodness. And it's the story of a man who was counted on and then often counted out again and again, and who never lost hope. Shimon Peres reminds us that the state of Israel, like the United States of America, was not built by cynics. We exist because people before us refused to be constrained by the past or the difficulties of the present. And Shimon Peres was never cynical. It is that faith, that optimism, that belief, even when all the evidence is to the contrary, that tomorrow can be better, that makes us not just honor Shimon Peres, but love him. The last of the founding generation is now gone. Shimon accomplished enough things in his life for 1,000 men. But he understood that it is better to live to the very end of his time on earth with a longing not for the past, but for the dreams that have not yet come true. An Israel that is secure in a just and lasting peace with its neighbors. And so now this work is in the hand of Israel's next generation. In the hands of Israel's next generation and its friends. Like Joshua, we feel the weight of responsibility that Shimon seemed to wear so lightly. But we draw strength from his example and the fact that he believed in us, even when we doubted ourselves. Scripture tells us that before his death, Moses said, "I call upon heaven and earth to bear witness this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live." Uvacharta b'chaim. Choose life. For Shimon, let us choose life as he always did. Let us make his work our own. May God bless his memory, and may God bless this country and this world that he loved so dearly. Shimon. Toda rabba. Chaver yakar.
שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר ישראל. אדוני שומרך, אדוני צילך על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה. אדוני ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך. אדוני ישמור צאתך ובואך, ואתה בשיר אדוני משוררים לבוקר, שוררים לבוקר. שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר ישראל. אדוני שומרך, אדוני צילך על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה. אדוני ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך. אדוני ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם.